I used to measure my days by how fast the numbers on my screens turned green. That was how I convinced myself I was still winning. Still the man in the glass fortress, until a barefoot kid slipped past a gate built to keep the world out and asked if I would trade dollars for a miracle. And I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because fear often wears a grin when it has nowhere else to hide. 10 years in a wheelchair will sand you down in ways you don't notice. You get good at being polite and proud. At the same time you keep your voice steady while your bones scream. You learn to build a life out of schedules and painkillers and silence. The morning it started, I was parked by the window, like always, coffee going cold, portfolios glowing like little suns that couldn't warm a thing, and Reyes, my head of security, buzzed me to say there was a kid at the door who talked like an old soul and would not leave, so I said, "Fine, bring him up. Let me see what kind of magic trick today thinks it has on me." He came in small but steady shirt, clinging by two brave buttons, dust on his knees, like he'd been fixing the road himself, a carved lighthouse hanging on a string against his chest. Not fancy, just honest. And he didn't stare at the art or the crystal. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "Mr. Mason, would you trade some of those dollars for a miracle today?" And I shot back with the old reflex kid. I could buy 10,000 miracles before lunch. And he smiled like he'd been waiting for that line and said, "Then why are you still waiting? You know what I mean." Pride feels like heat in your ears when it's been touched. I rolled back from the desk and gave the speech. People expect from a man who owns too many suits. "Do you even know who you're talking to?" And he nodded, like we were in a corner store. And I'd forgotten milk. A man who forgot what believing feels like, and yeah, that happened. The laugh died in my throat, and grief, which had been living in my house like a paying tenant, exhaled in the room. He pulled a folded scrap from his pocket, edges gone soft from being held, and held it with both hands like it was a fragile plate. "This doesn't cost anything," he said. "It's how you pay," and I could have had Reyes escort him out, with the same gentle force we use on drunks who wander close. But the staff had been whispering for months because the place felt heavy, and a child's voice can cut fog better than a chandelier. So I took the paper and read the pencil words. "Strength finds the heart that still believes, no verse number, no signature, just a sentence that sounded like it had walked a long way without shoes." "You expect me to pin this on the fridge and stand up," I said, and he shook his head. "No. I expect you to remember. You have a heart, then." He sat by the window without asking, folded his legs and started humming a tune that knew rain. Time slowed, markets moved, pain buzzed like bad wiring in my legs. And finally I said, "You didn't come to sing." And he gave me this sideways grin. "You're not great at patience, are you?" "What's your name?" I asked Miles, he said. "Just Miles," and when I asked about the lighthouse, he thumbed it and said, "My mom whittled it the night a storm cut the lights. Said a lighthouse doesn't panic when the sea throws a tantrum. It just keeps shining." And he looked at my chair, then the view, then nowhere at all, and asked if he could pray. I'm not a verse-on-the-wall guy, but I remember my mother's hand on my forehead, during bad fevers, the clean smell of Vicks and whispered courage, so I shrugged. "I won't stop you," I said. And he prayed like a kid who believes the door is already open. Nothing flowery, just a stubborn heart, softer pride, pain to forget my address for a while. And when he finished, I realized I'd been holding my breath. The city behind the glass had turned to watercolor, and the house, for the first time in years, felt like it might be able to breathe. He fell asleep in this chair, with the lighthouse pressed to his palm, staff peeked in like raccoons, curious and careful. And somewhere after midnight, I let my eyes rest, and morning climbed the room like a tide. And pain was still there, because pain is punctual, but something else was there too, warmth. Not blanket warmth, not circulation, trickery, something like a pilot light trying to remember its job. I focused on my right foot, the way a liar focuses on truth when he's tired of lying. Nothing, then a spark, then a twitch, so small, I wanted to call it imagination, until it happened again. And I made a sound that would have embarrassed me any other day, and Miles lifted his head and said, "When you feel light again, don't be afraid it's real," and I yelled for Reyes and he sprinted and Dr. Patel did what science does, checked reflexes, measured sensation, careful words about minimal motor response and increased signal. And we don't know why yet, but we can see it, and the impossible had the nerve to show up in daylight. News creep is a living thing in a house like mine. Phones lit, investors called a reporter I used to golf with, tried to bring a camera crew, and I told everyone to wait, to breathe, to leave. And when I turned to thank Miles, he was gone. Blanket folded scrap of paper on my desk, like a small flag, saying I was here. Reyes ran a quiet search, street corners, church basements, food lines, and a driver said he'd seen the lighthouse charm near an after-school spot called Lighthouse House. And I walked in on parallel bars with a therapist at my shoulder and a stubborn pride in my jaw. And there he was on a cinder block floor, showing a smaller kid how to sharpen a pencil without losing a finger. And he looked up like he'd expected me, I knew. "Want to see the miracle," he said, and pointed at a crooked painting on the wall. A man mid-stand from a chair, light drawn like relief, and the caption in kid letters, "If you believe, even metal learns to feel." And my hands shook, and he placed a little clay lighthouse in my lap. "Trade complete, your dollars are now dreams." That sentence worked me like a key in a stiff lock. I sold a division I liked more than I admitted. Then the one the magazines loved me for, because it made me sound like I could predict weather. And we built Beacon on the west side, pediatric care, with sunlight on purpose, and homework rooms at Lighthouse House where snacks don't come with lectures. And Victor Parr from the board walked into my study with spreadsheets like a sword and said, "Cal Charity is a press release, not a plan. You can't rewrite mandate because a child made your toes wiggle." And I told him maybe the mandate was wrong, and so was I. And he said, "The street rewards certainty. You're broadcasting chaos." And I said, maybe the street should learn something new. And he asked from a broken lighthouse and a boy who prays. And I said from a man who finally stopped lying to himself. And yeah, that conversation ended with him keeping his shares and his distance. Weeks slid into a rhythm therapy paperwork laughter that didn't sound like it was faking. Then the deeper twist arrived with a cough and a sway. Miles started showing up late and pale, still smiling, like he was saving a punchline for last. And one afternoon, he fainted, and Dr. Patel found the words that hit like fists, and we moved him into a room with water out the window and the clay lighthouse on the table, and I read to him every night the sports page, the weather, the book, where a kid sails a bathtub into a storm, and he would thump the lighthouse like a button to keep the lights on and tell me not to start crying because I already got my miracle, and I told him it wasn't enough. And he said it was never supposed to be for me, and said it like he was teaching me to tie my shoes, simple, firm kind. Sunrise came thin and breakable, and he squeezed my hand and whispered, "Ipa believing." And then he did the thing I had most feared, and somehow already knew, and a grown man either breaks or becomes something new. I broke first, then I sold the company. Everyone said I'd die owning, and the headlines called me reckless and redeemed, and we finished Beacon and put a line on the door. Trade comfort for compassion. Believe and live. And I watched a father read it and cry without wiping his face, and a month later a girl rang a bell because her scans were clean, and the whole lobby clapped like hands could stitch time back together. Years smooth the sharp edges, but they don't erase the shape the city learned to say. Beacon, like a friend, Victor retired to a lawn, too perfect to be honest, and mailed a check every December. With no note, my son started calling after his boy was born, and asked careful and ashamed how to hold a baby. Without looking afraid, my legs have their own weather. Some days, sunshine, some days hail, and I walk the corridors paid for with a hand on the rail, and no shame in the grip. The clay lighthouse sits on my desk. The folded paper lives in my wallet, behind the license where identity sits. And when I stand in front of a crowd, and they want the tidy speech, I give them the messy truth. A kid walked through my gates and told me my heart had gone quiet, and I traded dollars for a miracle and got back a map for all the days that still hurt. So argue with me, please do. Was it medicine, faith, both, or a story that makes pain feel like it has a purpose? Should a company protect the bottom line or the lives under it? When those two things start a fight, if a kid like Miles stood at your gate, would you wave him in or wave him away? You know what I mean? Drop your city, take your own story of a moment that tilted your life in a better direction. Tell me where you stand. On comfort versus compassion. On coincidence versus calling on what we owe each other. When the sky goes dark, I'll be in the comments listening.